The Last Wolf of Black Briar. Part 1. The Arrival at North Briar Forest. My name is Adrian Holt, and until the winter I arrived at North Briar Forest, I believed I understood the wilderness. I had spent years studying wildlife behavior, tracking animal populations, mapping habitats, learning how ecosystems adapt when humans interfere with them. I believed there was very little left in Britain that could truly surprise me. I was wrong, because deep within one of the oldest sections of the North Briar Forest, something had survived. Something that should not have existed. Something that generations of forestry workers had quietly learned to respect. When I accepted the position as Junior Wildlife Manager for the UK Forestry Department, I considered it the opportunity I had been waiting for. I was 28 years old, unmarried, independent, and eager to prove myself. The role was everything I wanted. A chance to work directly with woodland conservation, a chance to monitor wildlife populations, a chance to protect one of Britain's most important forest areas. North Briar was not the largest forest in the country, but it was one of the most diverse. Ancient woodland stood beside managed forestry plantations. Deep valleys cut through the landscape. Streams ran beneath centuries-old trees, and scattered throughout the forest were sections that had remained almost untouched for generations, the kind of places where nature was allowed to exist without interference. At least, that was what I thought. The nearest town was small, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. A few shops, a village pub, a petrol station, a small population of people who had lived beside the forest their entire lives. The locals had a complicated relationship with North Briar. They loved it. They walked there. They photographed it. They explored its trails. But there were certain areas they avoided. Not because of signs, not because of official warnings, because of stories. When I first arrived, I assumed they were just that. Stories. Every rural area has them. Every forest has something people whisper about. A strange noise, a mysterious sighting, an old legend passed down through generations. Usually there is a simple explanation. A deer moving through trees, a shadow, seen in poor light, a person mistaken for something else. I had always trusted evidence over rumors. My first week at North Briar was mostly paperwork, orientation, safety procedures, learning the boundaries of my assigned area, meeting the forestry staff. The team was smaller than I expected. Most of the senior workers had spent decades in the forest. They knew every trail, every stream, every difficult section of terrain. They were practical people, not the kind who believed in myths. That was why I noticed something strange. Whenever the western section of the forest was mentioned, the mood changed. The conversations became shorter. People avoided volunteering for those patrols, and whenever I asked why, I received the same answer. Just take the eastern routes for now. At first, I thought it was because I was new. Maybe they were protecting me from the more difficult areas. But after several days, my curiosity got the better of me. I was sitting in the forestry office one afternoon, reviewing maps, when Peter Collins walked in. Peter was one of the senior forestry officers. He had worked at North Briar for over 30 years. He wasn't the type of man who wasted words. Everything about him suggested experience. The kind of experience earned through thousands of hours outdoors. He looked at the map on my desk. You've been studying the western boundary. It wasn't a question. I smiled. Is it that obvious? Yes. He pulled up a chair. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he pointed to a section of woodland marked Compartment 12. Don't go there alone. I looked at the map. Why? He leaned back. Because nobody goes there alone anymore. I waited for him to explain. He didn't. Instead, he looked toward the window. Beyond the glass was the endless stretch of forest. How much do you know about North Briar? I shrugged. Enough to know it's an important habitat. Peter nodded. And how much do you know about what lives here? Most of the documented species. He looked back at me. Documented. The way he said the word stayed with me. That evening, I mentioned the conversation to some of the other staff. Most laughed, not because Peter was joking, because they knew exactly what he meant. One of the older forestry workers, a man named Robert Gray, sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. Gray had been with the department almost as long as Peter. His face carried the marks of decades outdoors, weathered, tired, experienced. You weren't told about Blackbriar yet? I shook my head. No. He looked at Peter. Peter simply nodded. Gray sighed. Probably better you hear it from us. He reached across the table and tapped the map. There's something in that part of the forest. I smiled slightly. A fox? No. A large cat? No. A dog? Gray looked at me. No. The room became quiet. Then he said something I still remember. There is something old in those woods. I expected someone to laugh. Nobody did. Gray continued. Over the years, there have been sightings. Of what? He hesitated, then answered carefully. Something that shouldn't be there. I studied his expression. He wasn't trying to scare me. That was what made it unsettling. He was describing something he genuinely believed. How many sightings? Not many. How many is not many? Enough. Peter interrupted. Most were dismissed. Why? Because people see strange things in forests. That was true, and I knew it. But then Gray added, one wasn't dismissed. He looked down at his hands. About 15 years ago, one of our patrol officers encountered it. What happened? He was checking boundary markers late at night. Gray paused. He heard something following him. I waited. He assumed it was deer. Then, he saw it. The room became silent. What did he see? Gray looked directly at me. A large animal. What kind? He took a breath. Something between a wolf and something else. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. No. Gray nodded. It didn't make sense to him either. But the officer reported seeing a large, dark-furred animal standing upright briefly before dropping back onto all fours. He described it as having a broad chest, long, powerful limbs, thick black fur, a wolf-like head, eyes that appeared unusually intelligent. The official explanation was exhaustion. The man had been working long hours. It was late. Visibility was poor. The human brain is very good at creating patterns in darkness. Everyone understood that, including the officer himself, at least at first. But after making the report, he quit within weeks, never returned. I looked back at the map. Why isn't this public? Peter answered immediately. Because there is no confirmed evidence. But people are restricting access. Yes. Why? He looked at me. Because whether people believe the stories or not, he pointed toward Compartment 12. Something is happening there. That was my first real introduction to Black Briar. Not the forest, the secret. Over the following weeks, I would learn that the restrictions were not new. They had existed quietly for decades. Certain trails were redirected, certain areas were monitored more closely. Certain patrols were never done alone. Not because anyone believed in monsters, not because of folklore, because experienced people had noticed patterns, and experienced people learned something important. Nature rarely repeats itself without a reason. I wish I could say I ignored the warnings, that I immediately dismissed everyone as superstitious, but that would not be true. The truth was more complicated. I believed there was an explanation. I believed whatever people had seen had to be something natural, something scientific, something that could be studied. And perhaps that belief was the reason I made the decision that changed everything. Because instead of staying away from Black Briar, I decided to investigate it. Part 2: The Warnings of Black Briar. For the first few weeks at North Briar Forest, I tried to ignore the stories, not because I didn't believe the people telling them, because I did. That was the part that bothered me. Peter Collins and Robert Gray were not the type of men who invented stories to entertain themselves. They were forestry professionals, people who spent their lives observing nature, people who understood the difference between imagination and evidence. If they were concerned about something in Black Briar, then I needed to understand why. I started with the obvious approach: research, official records, wildlife surveys, historical reports, anything that might explain the strange reputation surrounding Compartment 12. At first, I found nothing unusual. The public records showed exactly what I expected. North Briar Forest contained roe deer, foxes, badgers, several species of birds of prey, small mammals common throughout the region. Nothing remarkable, nothing that explained the warnings. But then I began looking deeper. Older documents, archived forestry notes, internal habitat surveys. That was where things started to change. The first thing I noticed was the pattern. Every few years, there was a mention of something unusual. Never a confirmed sighting. Never anything officially recorded as a new species. Just small observations. A damaged camera trap. Unusual tracks. Missing livestock near the forest boundary. Reports of a large animal moving through areas where no large animal should have been. Each incident alone meant very little, but together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, I found an old folder buried beneath several decades of forestry reports. It contained handwritten notes from patrol officers. Most of them were routine. Weather conditions, tree damage, wildlife numbers, maintenance requests. Then I found one entry that made me stop. The handwriting was different, less formal, more personal. The date was from 1976. The officer had written, "Something is moving through the western section that I cannot identify." Below that, "Tracks do not match local wildlife." And finally, "Avoid entering alone after dark." That was it. No dramatic conclusion, no explanation, just a warning. I showed the report to Peter the following morning. He read it quietly, then placed it back on my desk. "Where did you find that?" "The archive." He looked mildly surprised. "I thought those had been removed." "Removed?" He immediately corrected himself. "Misfiled." The pause before that answer told me everything. Peter knew more than he was saying. "How many people have seen it?" Peter looked through the office window. The forest stretched endlessly beyond the glass. I don't know. That doesn't sound very convincing. No, he turned back toward me. Because nobody has ever agreed on exactly what they saw. Meaning, some described a large wolf. Others, something bigger. I waited. Peter sighed. Adrian, the problem isn't that people saw something strange. He tapped the report. The problem is that different people, decades apart, describe the same thing. That afternoon, I spoke with Robert Gray again. Unlike Peter, Gray seemed less reluctant to discuss it, perhaps because he was older, perhaps because he had already accepted that some mysteries never receive satisfying answers. We sat outside the forestry building, overlooking the western hills. Do you believe it's real? Gray didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched a group of birds moving between the trees. Finally, he said, I believe people are very good at explaining away things they don't understand. I waited, and I believe experienced people know when something doesn't fit. Gray told me about the patrol officer who had left years earlier. His name was Michael Henshaw. He had worked in North Briar for almost 12 years. According to Gray, Michael was not someone who frightened easily. He knew the forest better than anyone. What happened that night? Gray looked toward the western boundary. He was checking an old access route. Alone? Yes. Why? Because that's what people did back then. He paused. Things were different. Michael had been walking the old forestry track shortly after midnight. The weather was calm. Visibility was poor, but not dangerous. At first, he thought he was hearing deer moving through the trees. Then he noticed something strange. The movement was following him. Not ahead, not behind. Parallel, keeping pace. He stopped. It stopped. He moved. It moved. After several minutes, he became convinced he was not dealing with ordinary wildlife. Did he see it? I asked. Gray nodded slowly. Yes. What did he describe? Gray looked uncomfortable, not frightened. Uncomfortable. Something large. How large? Large enough that he thought his eyes were lying to him. That answer stayed with me, because experienced people don't usually describe wildlife that way. They measure, they compare, they identify, unless something refuses to fit. According to Michael's report, the animal emerged briefly between the trees, only for a few seconds, but long enough for him to see. Dark fur, a powerful body, a wolf-like head, long limbs, and eyes that seemed to focus on him with unusual intelligence. Michael did not claim it was a monster. He did not claim it was supernatural. His report was surprisingly practical. He wrote, "Unknown large predator. Behavior unlike any known British species." The official response was exactly what I expected. Fatigue, poor lighting, stress, a mistaken identification. The explanation was reasonable. Scientifically, it made sense. But there was one detail nobody could explain. Michael Henshaw quit 3 weeks later. Not transferred, not reassigned. Quit. A man who had spent more than a decade working in forests walked away from the profession entirely. I asked Gray what happened to him. Nobody knows. What do you mean? He moved away. Where? Gray shrugged. He never told anyone. That seems strange, but not impossible. People leave jobs, people start new lives, people disappear from old circles. Yet something about it bothered me. That evening, I returned to my apartment and reviewed the maps of North Briar again. Compartment 12 sat at the far western edge. Beyond it were steep valleys, dense woodland, old terrain, unsuitable for modern forestry operations. A place people rarely visited. A place that was difficult to monitor. And perhaps a place where something unusual could remain hidden. The next morning, I made a decision. I would investigate properly, not as someone chasing a legend, not as someone looking for a monster, as a wildlife manager. My job was understanding the ecosystem. If there was an unidentified animal living inside North Briar, then I needed evidence, not stories, not rumors, evidence. I began setting up remote cameras along the edge of Compartment 12. Nothing invasive, nothing designed to disturb the habitat, just observation. That was how wildlife research worked. You watched, you waited, you learned. For several days, the cameras recorded exactly what I expected. Foxes, deer, birds, small mammals, normal forest activity. I started wondering whether everyone had simply been wrong. Perhaps there was nothing there. Perhaps decades of rumors had grown from a handful of misunderstood encounters. Perhaps Black Briar was just another forest with another old story. Then, on the sixth morning, I found the first track. It was beside a muddy section of trail near the western boundary. At first glance, I assumed it belonged to a large dog. Then I crouched down, looked closer, measured it, and immediately knew it wasn't. The shape was wrong. The size was wrong. The spacing between the toes was wrong. Whatever had made that print was not a domestic animal. I photographed it, measured it again, checked the surrounding area. There were more, not many, but enough. A trail, a direction, a pattern. The animal had crossed the path during the night, and it had not been wandering. It had been moving with purpose. That was the moment I understood something important. The stories surrounding Black Briar were not based on fear. They were based on observation. People had seen something. They simply didn't have the evidence to explain it. Now, I did. I should have reported the tracks immediately. That would have been the correct procedure. Instead, I did something I still think about. I followed them. Not far, only a short distance. Just enough to understand where the animal had gone. That decision would eventually lead me into the oldest part of North Briar Forest. A place where the trees were centuries old. A place where maps became unreliable. And a place where I would discover that the tracks I had been following were not the only tracks watching me. Part 3, the territory. I should have reported the tracks immediately. That was the correct decision, the professional decision, the decision any wildlife manager would have been expected to make. Instead, I followed them, not because I wanted to prove the stories were true, not because I was looking for some impossible discovery. I followed them because at that moment, I believed I was doing my job. An unidentified animal had entered a protected forest area. My responsibility was to understand it, observe it, document it. That was all. At least, that was what I told myself. The trail began near the western boundary of Compartment 12. The first few prints were clear. After that, they became harder to follow. Not because the animal had disappeared, because it moved differently from anything I had tracked before. Most animals leave a predictable pattern. A deer follows the easiest route. A fox uses familiar paths. A badger returns to established tunnels and trails. This was different. The tracks crossed fallen branches, moved through dense vegetation, changed direction, without obvious reason. It was almost as if the animal wasn't traveling through the forest. It was navigating it. I followed for approximately 20 minutes before stopping. The forest had changed, not dramatically, nothing obvious, but enough that I noticed. The managed woodland behind me had slowly disappeared. The straight lines of planted trees were gone. The undergrowth had become thicker. The ground was uneven. Ancient roots twisted beneath layers of moss. This was old woodland, the kind of forest that existed before modern forestry practices shaped the landscape. Compartment 12 wasn't simply another section of North Briar. It was a place that time had mostly forgotten. I checked my GPS. The signal was unstable. Not unusual in dense woodland, but enough to make me uncomfortable. The map showed my location, yet the terrain around me looked older than the satellite images suggested. I made a note of it. Old maps are often inaccurate in forests. Trees change, paths disappear, land use evolves. Nothing unusual. Still, I found myself looking back more often than I normally would. After another 15 minutes, I found the first sign that something about this place was different. A tree, an enormous oak. The trunk was wider than any I had seen in the surrounding forest. Its bark carried several deep marks, 4 parallel grooves, fresh enough that the exposed wood beneath them was still pale. I stepped closer. At first, I assumed they were from a deer. Large stags sometimes rub their antlers against trees, but I quickly dismissed that. The marks were too high, too deep, and too evenly spaced. I raised my hand toward them. The lowest mark was above my head. A deer could not have made them. I photographed the tree. Then I searched the surrounding area. Within 100 meters, I found more. Some were old, some were recent. The pattern repeated. Large trees, similar height, similar spacing, territorial markings. That was the only explanation that made sense. Whatever lived here was maintaining a boundary, a territory. The thought should have comforted me. Territorial behavior is normal. Animals protect resources, food, shelter, breeding areas. It is one of the most basic principles of ecology. But something bothered me. The size of the territory and the intelligence behind it. The markings weren't random. They followed routes. They appeared near streams, along ridges, at natural crossing points, almost like a network, a map. I continued deeper. The further I traveled, the quieter the forest became. At first, I didn't notice. Then I realized what was missing. Birdsong, not completely, but enough. The normal background noise of woodland had faded. No constant movement, no sudden calls, no signs of small animals nearby. The forest wasn't empty. It was cautious. I stopped beside a small stream to record my observations. The water was clear, cold, running over smooth stones. The kind of place that should have attracted wildlife. Instead, there were almost no tracks, no deer, no fox, no small mammals, only one trail, a large trail. It crossed the stream at the shallowest point. I crouched beside it. The print was older than the others, but unmistakable. The same animal. Only this one was larger, much larger. I checked my measurements again, then again. The first print I had found, near the boundary, had already been unusual. This one was different, bigger, heavier. The stride length suggested a powerful animal, an adult, possibly the same species, possibly not. I looked back toward the direction I had come from. A thought entered my mind. The animal I had been tracking was not necessarily the largest thing living in Black Briar. That was the first moment I considered the possibility that everyone had misunderstood the legend. For years, people had spoken about one creature, the Black Briar wolf, the animal, the thing people saw. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if the sightings were not of one individual? What if they were seeing a population, a hidden lineage, a group of animals that had survived because nobody had ever looked closely enough? I dismissed the thought. It was too early, too speculative. Wildlife science requires evidence, not imagination. I reminded myself of that. Then I noticed something else. A camera. Not mine. One of the forestry department's older remote units. It had been mounted on a tree approximately 2 meters above the ground. The casing was damaged, the lens was cracked, the entire unit had been torn downward. I examined the damage. It wasn't weather. It wasn't falling branches. Something had deliberately pulled it from the tree. I photographed the camera. Then I checked the mounting point. The screws were still embedded in the bark. Whatever removed it had not pushed the camera loose. It had pulled it apart. The force required was considerable. I looked at the damaged casing. For the first time since entering compartment 12, I felt something other than curiosity. I felt caution. I decided to turn back. Not because I was afraid, because fieldwork teaches you an important lesson. Knowing when to stop is part of knowing what you are doing. I marked my location, saved my notes, checked my equipment, then began walking back. The journey out should have taken less time. Instead, I found myself slowing down. Every few minutes, I stopped, listened, watched. Not because I had heard anything, because I had begun to understand something. The forest knew I was there. It was a strange feeling, one I struggled to explain. I wasn't being chased, I wasn't being followed, there was no obvious threat, but the entire woodland seemed aware of my presence, as if I had entered a place where I did not belong. Then I noticed something. My equipment locker. Not physically, mentally, the memory of it. The photographs I had collected, the track measurements, the reports. Someone had moved them. Someone had been looking. At the time, I thought it was a person, someone curious, someone concerned. I would later realize I had been thinking too narrowly. The next morning, I arrived at the forestry office earlier than usual. My photographs were still on my desk. My notes were untouched, but something had changed. A single folder had been moved. The folder containing my track photographs. It was no longer beneath my spare equipment. It sat directly on top, visible, waiting, a silent message. Someone had seen what I found. I asked Peter if anyone had access to the storage area. He hesitated. Maintenance. Did anyone access my locker? I don't know. That answer bothered me. Not because he didn't know, because he didn't immediately say no. Later that afternoon, Peter found me studying the maps again. This time, he didn't ask what I was doing. He simply placed an old canvas folder on the desk. Inside were aerial photographs, decades old, black and white. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then Peter placed several images beside each other. Different years, different seasons, same section of forest, compartment 12. The first photograph showed a large, untouched valley. The second showed the same valley years later. A small area around it had been marked restricted. The third photograph showed an even larger restricted zone. then another, then another. The boundary had slowly expanded over decades, not because of logging, not because of conservation projects, because access had gradually been reduced. Why? I asked. Peter looked at the photographs. Because every time people went deeper, he paused. The same thing happened. What thing? They saw something they couldn't explain. That evening, I reviewed everything I had collected. The tracks, the damaged camera, the markings, the reports, the warnings. The pattern was becoming clearer. Whatever lived in Black Briar was not an aggressive animal searching for victims. It was something far more interesting. A creature that had survived by avoiding humans, learning them, understanding their habits. The following morning, I made a decision. I would return, but this time I would go deeper, not with curiosity, not with assumptions, with preparation. GPS, camera equipment, emergency supplies, a proper field kit. I would document everything. Then I would leave. That was the plan. A simple wildlife survey, a scientific observation. Nothing more. But plans change, especially when you enter a place where something else is already observing you. 3 days later, just after sunrise, I entered compartment 12 again, and this time I was not alone. Part 4. Into the heart of Black Briar. 3 days after my first expedition into compartment 12, I returned. This time, I was prepared. Not because I expected danger, because I had learned something important. The forest deserved respect. Every environment has rules, every ecosystem has boundaries. And the longer I spent studying North Briar, the more I understood that compartment 12 had boundaries of its own. Before leaving that morning, I informed the forestry office of my route. I logged my planned location. I checked my equipment, battery levels, GPS signal, emergency supplies, communication equipment, everything. I was not going in blindly. I was conducting a professional survey. At least, that was what I told myself. Peter watched me prepare. He didn't try to stop me. That surprised me. I expected another warning, another reminder. Instead, he simply said, "Stay on your route." I looked at him. "That's it?" He nodded. "That's it." Then, after a moment, he added, "And if something feels wrong," I waited. Listen to that feeling. It wasn't the advice I expected from an experienced forestry officer. Professionals rely on evidence, measurements, observation, not instinct. But the longer I worked outdoors, the more I understood something. Instinct is not always irrational. Sometimes it is simply experience arriving before the explanation. I entered compartment 12 shortly after sunrise. The weather was clear. A thin layer of mist rested between the trees. The kind of morning where the forest appears almost unchanged from a century ago. No roads, no machinery, no signs of modern life. Just trees, water, and silence. I followed the same route as before. Past the old oak tree, past the damaged camera location, past the stream where I had discovered the larger tracks. This time, I moved slower. I wasn't just following evidence. I was observing everything. The plants, the terrain, the animal activity, the changes in the environment. The first thing I noticed was the deer, or rather, the lack of them. North Briar had a healthy deer population. They were common throughout the managed sections of the forest. But here, Nothing. No movement, no tracks, no signs of feeding. It was as if the entire area had been abandoned. That was unusual. Predators affect ecosystems, but not usually in such a simple way. A large predator does not make every animal disappear. It creates caution. It changes behavior. Animals become more alert. They move differently. They adapt. And that was exactly what seemed to have happened here. The forest had adapted. I continued deeper. The trees became older. The ground became rougher. The landscape changed from managed woodland into something almost untouched. Ancient roots pushed through the earth, moss-covered fallen branches. The forest floor was thick with years of decay. This wasn't just a place where animals lived, it was a place where animals had survived. Around midday, I stopped beside a rocky ridge overlooking the valley below. I checked my notes, compared the terrain with the old photographs Peter had shown me. This was the area where access had gradually been reduced, the center of the restricted zone, the place everyone avoided. I set up one of my cameras, a motion sensor unit facing a natural trail, then another near a water source. If something large was moving through this area regularly, I wanted evidence, not rumors, not stories, something undeniable. As I packed away my equipment, I noticed something strange, a smell. At first I couldn't identify it. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. It reminded me of several things at once. Wet fur, earth, the scent of a wild animal, but stronger, more noticeable. I looked around. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I continued walking. 10 minutes later, I found another marking. This one was different. Not on a tree, on the ground. A shallow scrape in the soil. Beside it were several strands of dark fur caught on a low branch. I carefully removed them, placed them in an evidence bag. My first physical sample. I remember feeling a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty. A discovery like this could change everything. An unknown predator in Britain, a surviving lineage, a species that science had overlooked. The researcher inside me wanted answers. The person inside me wanted distance. Those two parts of myself were beginning to disagree. I followed the trail further. Then I found something that stopped me. A second set of tracks. Not the same animal, different size, different stride, smaller, but the same shape, same structure, same unusual characteristics. I crouched down, studied them carefully. My first thought was impossible. Then I remembered the expanding restricted zones, the repeated sightings, the different descriptions over decades. There wasn't one animal. There were more. I stood slowly. The forest suddenly felt much larger. The idea changed everything. A single unknown predator would be remarkable. A hidden population would be extraordinary. A biological lineage surviving unnoticed in modern Britain would be something beyond anything I had ever imagined. I recorded my observations. My voice sounded different when I played it back later, less confident, more cautious. I said, multiple individuals confirmed, possible breeding population, further observation required. That was the scientific explanation, the professional explanation. But underneath those words was another thought, something I didn't record, something I didn't want to admit. If there were multiple animals, then the question wasn't whether one creature had survived. The question was, how long had they been here? The answer could have been decades, possibly longer. The old reports suddenly made more sense. Different people had seen different animals, different ages, different sizes, different behaviors. They weren't describing one mysterious creature. They were describing a species. I continued along the ridge. The trail eventually descended into a narrow valley, a place hidden from the surrounding forest, the kind of location that could easily go unnoticed. Steep slopes, dense vegetation, a reliable water source, protection from human activity. From an ecological perspective, it was almost perfect. Then I found the remains. Not human, animal, a deer. The body was partially concealed beneath vegetation. At first, I thought it had been a normal predator kill. But the more I examined it, the stranger it became. The kill was clean, efficient. No unnecessary damage, no signs of aggression. The animal had been taken as food, not attacked. That detail mattered because it told me something about the creature. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't hunting for sport. It was behaving like a predator, a very intelligent predator. I photographed the site, collected what evidence I could. Then I noticed something. The forest had gone silent again. Not gradually, instantly. I stopped moving. Every instinct told me something had changed. I looked around, nothing. The trees remained still. The wind continued, but the feeling was different. I was no longer alone. I slowly turned. At first, I saw nothing. Only trees, shadow, branches, then movement. Far across the valley, between two ancient oaks, something passed through the trees. It was too quick, too distant. My mind tried to identify it. A deer, a large dog, a trick of light, anything familiar, but then it stopped. And looked directly at me. Even at that distance, I knew. This was not a deer, not a dog, not anything I had encountered before. The body was massive, covered in thick black fur. The shoulders were unusually broad. The head was unmistakably wolf-like, but larger, much larger. The animal did not charge. It did not growl. It did not behave aggressively. It simply watched me, studying, assessing, almost as if it was trying to understand what I was. I reached slowly for my camera. The movement caught its attention. Its head shifted slightly, not like a frightened animal, like an intelligent one. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then the creature stepped backward, into the trees, and disappeared. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, but when it was over, I remained standing there for several minutes, trying to process what I had seen. Because the most frightening part was not its size, not its appearance, not the fact that it should not exist. The most frightening part was this: it had seen me before I had seen it. I returned to camp that evening with hours of footage, measurements, samples, evidence, everything I needed, except the one thing I wanted most: a clear image. When I reviewed the camera footage that night, I found something I had not noticed while in the forest. The camera facing the valley had captured movement. Not mine, not wildlife, the creature. For 3 seconds, the image was blurred, but it was enough. Enough to prove something extraordinary. I stared at the screen. Then, I noticed something else. The timestamp. The creature had appeared almost exactly 20 minutes before I reached that location. It had been there, waiting, watching, long before I knew it existed. That was the moment my understanding of Black Briar changed forever. I had entered the forest believing I was studying an animal. I was wrong, because whatever lived in that valley had already been studying me. Part 4, B, The Last Wolf. I spent most of that night watching the footage, not because I doubted what I had seen, because I was trying to understand it. There is a difference. Doubt asks, did this really happen? Understanding asks, what does this mean? And that was the question I couldn't escape. The footage was not perfect. The image quality was poor. The animal only appeared for a few seconds, but it was enough. The size, the shape, the movement, everything matched what the witnesses had described over decades. The reports, the warnings, the stories, they were all connected. I made copies of the footage immediately, multiple backups, separate locations. A habit I had developed through years of field research. Important evidence should never exist in one place, especially evidence that challenges what people believe to be possible. The next morning, I showed Peter. He watched silently. No surprise, no disbelief, just silence. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair. "You're sure?" I almost laughed. After everything I had seen, that was his question. "Peter, I was standing there." He nodded. "I know." Then he looked at the screen again. "But I needed to hear you say it." I expected excitement. I expected questions. Instead, Peter looked tired. Not afraid, not shocked. Tired. Like a man who had spent years carrying a secret he never wanted to own. "How long have you known?" I asked. Peter didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "Known what?" I looked at him. "That something is living in Black Briar." He sighed. "We suspected." "That's not the same thing." "No." He looked toward the window. "It's not." The Peter explained something I hadn't considered. The forestry department had never been searching for a monster. They had been monitoring unusual ecological changes. Over the years, they noticed patterns, wildlife avoiding certain areas, predation events that did not match known species, remote cameras being damaged, strange tracks appearing and disappearing, nothing that could prove a new species existed, but enough to make experienced people pay attention. "Why wasn't this reported?" I asked. Peter looked at me. "And what would we report?" That question stopped me, because he was right. A forestry department cannot announce possible unknown wolf-like predator living in British woodland. Without evidence, without samples, without proof, the public would either panic or dismiss it. Neither outcome would help. "Then why keep it secret?" Peter shook his head. "We didn't." He paused. "We protected it." So that answer surprised me. Protected it? Peter nodded. "Think about it, Adrian." He pointed toward the map. "Every time humans discover something rare, what happens?" I didn't answer. I knew. Research, tourism, development, attention. "Whatever this is," Peter continued, "it survived because people ignored it." He looked back at the screen. "The moment everyone knows it exists, that changes." For the first time, I realized something. The warnings about Black Briar were not warnings about the creature. They were warnings about us. Later that day, I returned to the archive. This time, Peter helped me. Together, We searched through decades of records, old forestry reports, wildlife surveys, historical maps, anything connected to the Western Forest. What we discovered changed everything. The earliest reports were not from recent decades. They went back much further. Before modern forestry, before the current boundaries existed, before North Briar became a managed woodland. The oldest document was not a sighting, it was a wildlife survey. From the early 20th century, the report mentioned an unusual large predator track discovered near the Western Valley. The surveyor assumed it was an error, a damaged print, a mistake. But attached to the report was a handwritten note. One sentence. The forest contains something that does not belong to our records. I read that sentence several times, not because it was dramatic, because it sounded exactly like every other account. Different people, different generations, same uncertainty. We began comparing descriptions. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Large size, dark fur, wolf-like appearance, avoidance of humans, highly territorial behavior, exceptional intelligence. But one detail stood out. Every witness described the animal as unusual, not because it looked frightening, because it looked familiar. It looked like something that shouldn't exist, but somehow should. The next week became the most intense period of research I had ever experienced. We began collecting evidence, carefully, quietly, no announcements, no public statements, just science. The first sample provided the first breakthrough. Analysis confirmed it was canid, related to wolves, but not matching any known British species. The genetic profile was incomplete. The sample was degraded. But one thing was clear. This was not a domestic animal. The discovery was extraordinary, but it also created a problem. If this animal existed, where had it come from? The answer came from combining everything we knew: the anatomy, the behavior, the isolation, the habitat, the history. The most likely explanation was not that a new species had suddenly appeared. It was that one had been hidden. A surviving branch of an ancient wolf lineage, a population isolated long enough to develop unique characteristics, not magical, not impossible, just incredibly rare. The creature we had called the Black Briar Wolf was not a wolf. Not exactly. It was something between history and modern biology, a survivor, a living connection to a world that had almost disappeared. But there was still one problem. The question everyone would eventually ask: if these animals had survived for so long, why had nobody found them? The answer was simple. They were experts at avoiding us. The more we studied the evidence, the clearer the picture became. They were not aggressive. They were cautious. They understood human patterns. They avoided roads, avoided buildings, avoided areas of heavy activity. They lived in the places humans had gradually abandoned, the forgotten corners of the landscape. They weren't hiding from the world. They were living beside it. That realization changed how I viewed my encounter. When I first saw the animal across the valley, I believed I had discovered it. I was wrong. The creature had known I was there. It had watched me, measured me, and decided I was not a threat. That was the most unsettling part. Not that it was intelligent. Many animals are intelligent. The unsettling part was the level of awareness. It understood distance. It understood observation. It understood when to leave. A week later, I returned to the valley, this time with cameras. Not to capture it, to observe. There is an important difference. I placed the equipment carefully, away from feeding areas, away from known trails. The goal was not to interfere. The goal was simply to learn. For several days, nothing happened. Then, on the fourth night, the cameras recorded movement. Not one animal, several. The footage was limited, dark, grainy, but unmistakable. A group moving silently through the valley. Adults, younger animals, a family structure, a population. I watched the footage repeatedly because the truth finally became clear. The stories had been wrong. Everyone had been wrong. There was no last wolf of Black Briar. There never had been. The creature people had feared. The creature people had whispered about. The creature they believed was a single, impossible survivor was not alone. It was part of something much older, something that had survived because it stayed hidden, because it adapted, because it learned. And then I noticed something in the final seconds of the recording. One of the animals stopped, turned, and looked directly toward the camera, not at the lens, past it, toward the direction of the forestry station, toward us. I froze, because I understood what I was seeing. The animal wasn't discovering the camera. It already knew it was there. That was when I finally understood the true nature of Black Briar. The forest was not hiding a monster. It was protecting a survivor. And now, we had to decide whether humanity was capable of doing the same. Part 5. After the silence. The hardest part about discovering something extraordinary is deciding what to do with it. Finding the truth is only the beginning. The responsibility that follows is often much heavier. For years, I had believed that discovery was the goal. As a wildlife manager, that was how I had been trained. Observe, document, understand, share knowledge. Science depends on information. Secrets do not advance understanding. But Black Briar forced me to consider something I had never expected. What happens when revealing the truth could put the discovery itself at risk? The evidence was undeniable. The tracks, the footage, the genetic samples, the behavioral observations. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. A previously undocumented large predator had survived within the forests of Britain. A relict lineage, a living reminder of an older ecosystem. Under normal circumstances, the next step would have been obvious. Report it, publish the findings, begin formal research. Invite experts from around the world. The scientific community would have been fascinated. The discovery would have made headlines. But headlines were exactly what concerned me, because I had seen what happened when people became interested in rare wildlife. A protected animal could become a tourist attraction overnight. A quiet forest could become a destination. People would want photographs, videos, proof that they had seen something most people never would. And the animals of Black Briar had survived for one simple reason. They avoided us. Peter understood this better than anyone. When I showed him the final footage of the group moving through the valley, He watched silently. Then he said, "So now you know." I looked at him. "Know what?" He folded his arms. "Why nobody wanted to find them." That sentence stayed with me, because it was true. Finding something is not always the same as helping it. Over the following months, a small number of people became involved. Not the public, not the media, only those who needed to know. Wildlife specialists, conservation officers, people who understood that the most important thing was protecting the habitat, not claiming the discovery. The official recommendation was simple: continue monitoring, protect the area, limit human access, avoid unnecessary disturbance. The western section of North Briar remained restricted, not because of danger, because of preservation. That distinction mattered. For decades, people had stayed away because they were afraid. Now, people stayed away because they respected what existed there. I continued my work at North Briar, but I was never the same person who arrived there months earlier. Before Black Briar, I believed the natural world was mostly understood. Not completely. There are always discoveries waiting. But I believed the unknown existed mainly in distant places, remote mountains, deep oceans, unexplored environments. I was wrong. Sometimes the greatest mysteries are not thousands of miles away. Sometimes they are hidden in the places we think we know best. I continued monitoring the forest. The cameras remained active. The data slowly accumulated. Most days showed ordinary wildlife: deer, foxes, birds, normal activity, but occasionally there would be something different, a shape moving through the trees, a set of tracks appearing overnight, a brief glimpse of dark fur disappearing into the woodland. The animals never approached the forestry station, never entered populated areas, never behaved aggressively. They simply continued living as they always had, quietly, carefully. Years later, I would sometimes return to the valley alone, not to search, not to prove anything, just to observe. The first time I returned after the discovery, I expected to feel fear. Instead, I felt something else: respect. I stood beside the old oak tree where I had first discovered the markings. The same tree, the same forest. But I was different. I placed my hand against the bark. The deep scratches were still there, evidence that something powerful had passed through that place. But the marks no longer felt threatening. They felt like a message, a reminder. The forest had existed long before me, and it would exist long after I was gone. One evening, near the end of my assignment at North Briar, I walked the edge of compartment 12. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees. The forest was quiet, peaceful, exactly as it had been the first time I entered. Then I heard it, a sound, deep, distant, not a roar, not a threat, a call. I stopped. Every part of me recognized it, not because I had heard it before, because I understood what it meant: communication, a signal between animals, a reminder that the valley was still alive. Guy looked toward the trees. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, a shape appeared. The largest of the animals I had seen, the one from the first encounter, the dark-furred male, the one whose presence had started everything. He stood at the edge of the woodland, watching, not hiding, not approaching, just observing. I did not raise my camera. I did not reach for my equipment. I didn't want evidence. Not this time. Some moments are not meant to be recorded. Some moments are meant to be remembered. We stood there for several seconds. Then he turned, slowly, and disappeared into the forest. That was the last time I saw him, at least that I know of. Years later, people still ask me if I believe the Black Briar Wolf exists. My answer depends on who is asking. If it is someone looking for a story, I tell them that forests are full of mysteries. If it is someone genuinely interested in wildlife, I tell them the truth. The evidence exists. The recordings exist. The samples exist. But the most important thing we learned from Black Briar was not the discovery of an unknown predator. It was the lesson that nature does not need our permission to survive. For centuries, we have measured the world by what we can find, what we can capture, what we can name. But sometimes, the most important things are the ones we choose not to disturb. The official records of North Briar contain no mention of a werewolf, no mention of a monster, no mention of a creature from folklore. Only a series of conservation reports, unusual activity, protected habitat, restricted access. But somewhere beyond the western boundary, beneath ancient trees that have watched generations come and go, something still moves. Something old, something intelligent, something that survived because it remained unknown. People called it the last wolf of Black Briar. They were wrong. It was never the last. It was simply the first one we found. And perhaps that is the most important difference. Because the wilderness still has secrets. The world is still larger than we imagine. And deep within the forgotten places of the earth, there may still be things waiting, not to be discovered, not to be controlled, only to be understood. The end.